So let's talk about refugees. How should we best help people in those situations? We had Wendy Francis here a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about helping people at the top of the cliff instead of at the bottom, empathising that it could be her and her family that needed that help one day, and what would be the best solution. What would be the most compassionate way to help the most people as much as possible?
Sure. Let me just give a bit of context of my time in Africa. While I was based in Uganda, we had a war going on in Democratic Republic of Congo, so we had refugees from there. There was a war in southern Sudan, so we had some very big Sudanese camps in northern Uganda. Kenya had a lot of Sudanese, Somalis in camps there. In Uganda, we also had internally displaced Ugandans in camps because of the Lord's Resistance Army and another group, the Allied Democratic Front, another internal rebel group. And then Tanzania also still had Burundians there from years and years ago. So there was, and some Somalis, I think. So there was a wide range of refugees in our region, and actually one of my colleagues, a Sudanese colleague, was pulled off the street in Khartoum and taken by the secret police and interrogated for 3 or 4 days. Wow. And then thrown back out onto the street. So he came down to Uganda, and I was working with him to get refugee status in Uganda. Huge process, so many stages in the process. But in the end, about 6 months later, he thought, actually, I can get back into southern Sudan, and where the northern regime doesn't have any influence, and I can continue working and having a positive impact on the work. So having worked with him on trying to get refugee status and looking at all that was happening there, I came to the conclusion that there's some key things that need to happen. Looking at the Sudanese in Uganda, they didn't just stay in the camp. They would, when things settled down, they would go back into southern Sudan and check their farms, check their properties, catch up with relatives that were still there. And being in northern Uganda, they had food that was very similar to what they had in Sudan. Culturally, it was very similar to what was in Sudan. So all the different measures that you would have, okay, they were safe, they were in a safe location just outside the borders, but they had all the different aspects that you'd want: religiously similar, culturally similar, culinary similar. They could visit their properties, they were close enough. So all of these things made it a much better situation for them than sending them halfway across the world to, say, Australia, which is
being able to visit
different.
their family at the drop of a hat would add a lot of social and emotional support to a very difficult situation, being displaced.
Yeah, you add all of those different stress levels, and if you can take as many of those out of the equation, you have a much better situation. So I believe, take Syria. We've got refugees in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. I would prefer us to work at that sharp end of how can we better help those in Jordan, Syria and Lebanon and give them greater support. So I did some figures on our, when they talked about the 12,000 Syrians, bringing them into the country. The cost of that was reported to be around $1 billion. That $1 billion going on, local costs for caring for families would have taken care of 200,000 refugees around that area. So from 12,000 that we bring out here, the same cost, we could have helped 200,000 on the ground in one of those neighbouring countries. And the neighbouring countries, again, they can slip back into the country when things settle down. If ISIS move out of that area, they can go back, check on their families, the ones that aren't in.
It's a much harder commute from Australia.
Lot harder. But we're seeing it. You know, the refugees here in Australia. There was one in the news recently, an Iranian. There was actually trafficking drugs. He came out as a refugee, and he's been trafficking drugs. So we've got to be careful. We've got to be wise in the way we help people. Bringing Afghanis out to Australia wasn't a wise move. Today we've got, it was 94% of them are still on Centrelink. It was only about 9% had jobs. So you've got, and that was after a 5-year period. So that is incredibly harmful. Not having a job is harmful enough. Being stuck in a location that is totally foreign religiously, culturally, culinary, everything, on every level, it's very different.
What would their employability be like? Like their industries and employment skills that they had in Afghanistan, how translatable are they in a developed technological Western society?
That's the challenge. That's the challenge because very few of them had any skills. I think it was UNICEF had to figure out parts of Afghanistan only had 1.6% literacy. In their own language, in their own country. That's incredibly, you just don't see that sort of level of literacy.
So their kind of skills would be agricultural?
That's right. You're subsistence farmers. So, that's wrong, to bring subsistence farmers into a first world country and expect them to thrive.
Stick them in an urban environment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Even in a rural environment where farming is so much more technical, and how you run a farm today is nothing like is being done over there, or that was done 40 years ago within Australia. It's developed so much. So it's unfair. It's not compassionate. It's actually pretty cruel to rip them out of there, think that we're doing something good for them, yet we're actually crippling them and perhaps building resentment. It
seems like it's more about making us feel good than actually helping.
Good photo op for the politicians, and it's a lot of virtue signalling from politicians. So each of the political parties now are trying to outdo themselves on how many refugees they'll take. You know, the Greens are always totally bizarre in their numbers, but you've got Labor and the Libs always trying to outdo each other as they come up to elections. That's not the way to do it. It's how can we be most compassionate, help the most with the money we can set aside for supporting refugees.
It even seems on the face of it, surely if we could have helped 200,000 Syrians instead of 12,000, surely that would have been a better photo op, a better headline.
No, because you don't get it here in the street or in your electorate of the local member doesn't get that photo op. Perhaps the Minister for Immigration could on in a refugee camp somewhere, but that doesn't translate much. Oh, that's over there. Politics is local. Everything you can do locally has that much bigger impact. And if you've got your arm around a new refugee, and you're the bee's knee sort of thing. Yep. So it is totally unfair, and it's a wrong-headed.
Now, if I was critical of that suggestion, I'd say, well, they're near a war zone. How can you count on Lebanon and Jordan to, now we need their agreement? It seems like there's a whole lot more hurdles and potential risks. Isn't it just easier to bring them here, less bureaucracy?
Probably a lot more bureaucracy. The camps are already set up in Turkey.
Aren't those full and overflowing?
Well, they're adjusting them, and they're adding more to them. There's 4 million within that whole region that are refugees. If you're talking about 12,000 out of 4 million, that's a drop. If you're talking 200,000, then that's a significant contribution we're making as a country. But
so are these people that you're saying are already outside of Syria, for example, already in Lebanon, already in Jordan, or are you talking about getting more people out of Syria?
No, they're already out.
Okay.
So
So what do we make their life better in the camp?
better in the camp, get them ready to go back in. So if you look at...
So what can we do for them now that they're not already getting in the camp?
Well, it'd be pretty basic living conditions. You could go in there, you could help them with probably some education for the kids. You could be doing language studies, because they'll always be beneficial. Business studies, you could be activity, just counselling.
The camps are pretty hard places.
They're tough. They're tough, no doubt.
I'm friends with the CEO of Open Doors Australia, and even just looking at their own website and YouTube channels, seeing the conditions in those camps, there's a lot of improvements that could go on. And the stories you hear are people who are working class, middle class mums and dads with proper jobs as engineers, and all of a sudden their kids are ripped out of school. The dad has got no job, and we know how that affects the average male identity. It is just a lack of purpose to life, a frustration of being able to provide the basic needs such as school for your kids, and the families are just... So to be able to even set up a school in one of those places and properly resource it would make such a big difference to the whole population of the camp, certainly hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, it would. And I think there's, I'd like to see more of an expanded in our foreign aid, that more Australians are being sent, whether it's community aid abroad type situations where they're going and they're trained in the specialties of within camps. But within the camps themselves, not everyone's in the camps. A lot of them are in Ankara, say, in the cities around Turkey. They've got jobs, or in Jordan. They're in Amman. A lot of them are actually working in the cities. And Lebanon's probably the main place that Christian refugees can go, because if you go into a camp in Turkey or Jordan, then the administrators are typically Muslim, and they may be quite hostile. Typically, they'll probably be somewhat hostile.
It's actually one of the flaws of the plan to bring 12,000 of the worst persecuted people from the Middle East, and they are the Christians, is that the persecution is so fierce that it's not even safe for them in the refugee camps.
No, so they would tend
and so they can't even get processed to get here.
That's right. They wouldn't even get to the line, because whoever controls that line would say, no, not today, not today, and you'd be continually fobbed off. So Lebanon, I think, has been a country of choice, and different organisations have been opening up their houses. Churches have been opening up additional rooms, and so there's a lot of Christians, Syrians going there. And that, look, we've got there's around 50, I think it's 50 majority Muslim countries in the world. So I'm not sure why we would take any Muslim refugees when you've got so many Muslim majority countries that should be able to take and help out in that area. But the opportunity for those from Christian countries in the Middle, Christians that are living in the Middle Eastern countries, it's really difficult for them to find an opportunity, and they probably won't be able to go back. The numbers of Christians that have left Iraq, I can't recall the number, but it was a dramatic number. It was something like 900,000 or 1 million, down to about 300,000. It was something incredibly dramatic. And the change in attitudes towards Christians will mean a lot of those people won't have a country to go back to, even when peace, general peace, breaks out in those countries.
So let's talk about diversity for the sake of diversity. So why not send Christians to Muslim majority nations? Why not bring a whole bunch of Muslims here? I mean, we love being culturally diverse and embracing people from all kinds of cultures. What's the problem with that?
Yeah, you wouldn't get any Christians into Muslim majority countries for a start. They would just reject them. They are taking very few as it is.
So they're not as big a fan of multiculturalism as we are?
No, not so much. And they are They're just not taking.
Are there any
They're
Muslim
taking
majority nations that are taking Christian refugees?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. There may be. I don't want to say there's none, but
If there's any,
yeah,
it's not many.
and you've got and perhaps Turkey and Jordan are doing that because of the massive numbers. But you've got the huge challenge of, if we're bringing Muslims into Australia, we've got to think about how people are going to adapt and integrate into life in Australia. So you've not only got the economic standards and their education, their work abilities, but if they're Christians to start with, then they're coming into a country that has got Judeo-Christian foundations. So there's more of a natural.
So what you're talking about
natural
is
synergy.
cultural compatibility.
Yeah, cultural compatibility. You've got to look at all the different compatibilities you can find and get as many of those, tick the box on as many of those. So if they do come here, if we do bring Syrian Christians into the country, they've got the very best opportunity to be able to thrive, because you don't want them to crash and burn. Again, you want people to thrive if they come in here.
Yep.
But the other challenge is, if we we look at the compatibility, we think, there's some engineers here and some doctors and some university lecturers, and there's some really gifted people, and we bring them to Australia. What does that do? It's a brain drain on rebuilding Syria. And, again, we end up with an unfair situation where we're sucking all the brains out of the potential people that can rebuild their nation.
Which reduces the chance of it getting back on their feet, which creates more refugees in the future because there's less people rebuilding it in the short term.
So there's so many complexities, and to say we just need to be compassionate, we just need to take more, is just being intellectually dishonest.
Yeah, I agree.